that way. In chapter 37, Genesis takes a turn now, and we begin to look at, with some, incredible depth as it relates to one of the sons of Jacob, and his name being Joseph. And this passage here, all the way through to the end, I suppose that next to the book of Job has given more comfort to God's people than maybe any other passage in all of the Bible. Really tremendous. When you are in deep waters and you are in having real difficulties and real trials, and there's that loss of perspective that comes with those kinds of things, it's always good to turn to this account concerning Joseph. It's one of the passages that I ask people to read more than maybe any other passage in counseling when they're in those situations. And occasionally we find ourselves in such situations. But let me say a couple things before we get into this section of Scripture. I think it is encapsulated by a passage in the New Testament in the book of Romans chapter 8. And I ask you to turn there just to build a foundation. I don't know how far we'll get in this chapter if we're going to be building foundations here and there, but we need to do that. From chapter 37 on all the way to the end now of the book, it really puts flesh and blood upon the truth of Romans chapter 8, verses 28 and 29. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. That's Joseph, and that's you and me. And then, lest we should begin to define what we think good is, he moves on and he defines it for us. For whom He foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. God works all things together for good in our lives because we love Him and we're the called according to His purposes, but He defines good as Christ-likeness and not stuff. And so we look at how He works in our lives, and truly He does work it together for good because it makes us like Jesus Christ. Now, if you there's a lot of commentaries on Genesis, and they will get into in great depth how Joseph is a type of Jesus Christ. I'm not going to do that. I think it's tremendous. Sometimes I look at some of that and I just go, okay. Okay, so Joseph was sold for 20 shekels of silver, and Jesus for 30, and so okay. Wow. I suppose there are minds that really get something out of that. To me, it's a 10 shekel difference. I still didn't. I have trouble connecting here in terms of, and there are, and I'm making fun of some of you that really into this kind of thing. Maybe not intentionally. It would never be my intent to do that, but sometimes the stuff breaks down a little more quickly than I like to see it break down, and all of the weight that we can put on these kinds of things. I think that Joseph is a type of Jesus Christ, and he is a type to the degree that is necessary to communicate this truth. That what God put Joseph through, He put Joseph through to make Joseph like Jesus. And what God puts you and I through, He puts us through in order that we might be a type of Him in one sense, and that we are being conformed into His image. Now, one of the other verse that's important as it relates to this passage, and then we'll move back to it, is in Romans chapter 5. Because God is going to give Joseph very early in his life here, and early in chapter 37, great promises concerning what He's going to do through Joseph's life. These are excellent, excellent promises. But what Joseph doesn't know, and what oftentimes we fail to recognize, is that there is tremendous preparation that can occur between the time that the promises are given to us in terms of God's call upon our life and then the fulfillment of those promises. And all of these things happen to us in order that character might be developed in our lives. And character is not something that's talked about very much today. Character as being some supreme thing, but it's very important to God. And God speaks in Romans chapter 5, and He says, and not only that, verse 3, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance. That is, as we continue to keep moving forward in the trials that are a part of our lives, that are conforming us into the image of Christ, as we move forward, we discover one thing for sure. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. God is faithful. And then perseverance produces or works character, and character hope. And so when I see what He's done in my life back here and how faithful He's been, then I look at the future with a confident expectation. And all the while, between these two things, character is being developed in my life. Define character. Jesus Christ. Again, that's the character that's being worked into our lives. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. And this is the genealogy of Jacob. Joseph being 17 years old, kind of a young guy. And he was feeding the flock with his brothers. A hard-working young man, by the way, as we'll see. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. And you can look at this and say, well, the little tattletale. The little snitcheroo, or little rat. What do we got, But really, as we see his character unfold, that's probably not the case. These sons were probably involved in some activity that was putting the entire family in jeopardy in terms of what they were doing and how they were handling the flocks and these things. And it really strikes at the work ethic and the responsibility and the integrity that Joseph had. He didn't like it, and he came back and he told his dad what in the world was going on. So this isn't a character flaw. This is something. Well, let's turn to Genesis chapter 37, and we will pick up where we left off last week. In chapter 37, we went through the first 11 verses last week, and what we saw there was that Joseph was not the youngest, but the next to youngest son of Jacob, and he was Jacob's favorite. And Jacob apparently, and really an act of, well, certainly not an act of wisdom, decided to broadcast that, and basically, I'm sure his intent was not to rub it in, but he gave him a multicolored jacket that none of the other brothers got, just Joseph. And then God gives Joseph two dreams, and in the dreams they communicate a couple of things. That ultimately he would be the head of this family, and that his brothers would bow down to him one day, and ultimately that even his father and his mother and his brothers would end up bowing down to him. He was going to become the chief someday. That's all there was to it. God gave him those dreams because God knew that he would need those dreams for the trials that he was about to go in. And there is always a process that occurs when God gives us vision of what He has in mind for our lives, and He gives us His dreams in terms of what is going to happen as it relates to our lives, something He plants in our hearts. There is always, between the time that He gives these things to us and the time that they come to full fruition, actually happen, there is a time always of preparation. Always a time of preparation. You and I as Christians are always being prepared. We are being prepared for heaven. We are being prepared to be around that throne of God. We're being prepared as the bride of Christ, and we are also being prepared as it relates to what God has called us to in terms of what it is His ministry in these last days. So there is always going to be preparation, and Joseph is now going to head into a 13-year period of preparation. Now that can make your heart sink, especially if you're in the middle of a trial right now. But this guy is ultimately going to become, in 1 hour, he is going to go from the pit of an Egyptian prison to becoming the second most powerful man on the face of the planet. He was not ready for it at 17. He didn't have the character for it. Wasn't in place yet. He had the character in place to be a 17-year-old. He had the character in place for this and for that, but not for what God had called him to yet. And so there's preparation. There's preparation in our life. The preparation always centers on one thing, and that is godly character. And when God puts us through the trials, the tribulation, the different things that we go through in preparation for greater and greater and greater fruitfulness in our lives, always be sure what He is striving for, what He is moving towards, is greater character in our lives. He's not waiting to put us in the position that He's ultimately going to put us in until we're rich. He's not waiting until we become secure and independently wealthy so that we can then go and do what it is. He's waiting and developing character. He's not waiting until I've developed my pastoral library and then I can head into the ministry. These things He can add into our lives in a moment. They mean nothing to Him. It's nothing to Him to add these things in a second in time. But character takes time. Character takes time. And that's what He's working. He gives the dream. Then He begins the preparation. And the preparation involves the development of character. When we are in trials, it is very wise to say to the Lord, "What character are you developing in me, Lord?" God doesn't put us in trials just to put us in trials. Oh, Dan Konchak hasn't been in a trial for a while. How'd I miss him? Is it time for a trial? No. There's a reason in every trial, and it relates to character. What kind of character? Christ-likeness. Godly character. That's the character that He's bringing out in our lives. And the same thing that Joseph went through, every single one of us as children of God are going to go through. There is no escaping it because there's no fruitfulness. There's no Christ-likeness any other way. And so this is why I think, along with the book of Job, this is one of the most encouraging passages in all of the Bible when we are in trials. Because when we are in trials, typically the first thing I lose is perspective. I don't know what's going on. Doesn't make any sense to me. And so isn't it nice to be able to get a bird's eye view of how God works through the testimony of Joseph so that we can understand how He works and why He works. And so this is what it is that is going on. It's character that is important to God. And then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Now, the last time they were in Shechem, it was a bad scene. They slaughtered the whole city. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem?" He's no doubt concerned about them and how long they've been gone, and maybe some mischief has come their way because of their history related to the city. And he said, "Maybe your brothers are feeding the flock there in Shechem. Come, I will send you to them." And so he said to him, Joseph did, Here I am, send me. And then he said to him, "Please go and see if it's well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." And so he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem, 50 miles, probably about a 2-day journey. Now a certain man found him, and there Joseph was, wandering in the field, obviously lost and looking for something. And the man asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" And so he said, "I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they're feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They have departed from here, for I heard them say, 'Let's go down to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan, which is about 20 miles. Now, when they saw him afar off, easily recognized by his brightly colored coat that he no doubt wore, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. They weren't going to put him in a headlock and give him a rabbit burn on the top of his head or some typical older brother thing or, put ice down his diaper or something like that. I mean, they wanted to kill this guy. Pretty intense scene. Pretty intense household. And they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming." That was the sore spot, the dream, that showed them bowing down to Joseph. "Come, therefore, and let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say some wild beast has devoured him. And we shall see, what will become of his dreams." That'll put the end of his dreams. We'll just kill the guy, throw him in a pit, and his dreams won't come true. But Reuben heard it, the oldest, and he delivered him out of their hands by saying, "Let's not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit," really in a broken cistern, "which is in the wilderness, and don't lay a hand on him." And he said this in order that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. And so it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that the first thing they did was they stripped him of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And they took him and they cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty and there was no water in it, and they sat down to eat a meal. So they've taken this guy and they've thrown him in there, and they want to kill him, and they know they're not supposed, they're trying to devise how in the world should we deal with him other than killing him, and they throw him down into the pit. Now in later on in chapter 42 of this book of Genesis, we find out a little bit more about what Joseph was doing while he was in the pit. And what he was doing was something like this. "Help! Please, let me out! Let me out!" He is pleading with them for his life. And he's begging them, anguish of soul he's pleading from, it tells us, that they would spare his life. He knows he is in deep, deep trouble with these guys. And so they sit down and they eat their lunch, a fairly hard-hearted group, I would say. And they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, which was a very fertile plateau on the east side of the Jordan River in Galilee. And so the Ishmaelites were doing very well, involved in trade, and they came with their camels bearing spices and balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to carry them down to Judah. And so, to Egypt rather. And so Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? We don't make any money off of that. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. And then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. Now you can imagine this guy. He is just running an errand for Dad. You put yourself in his shoes. He just was going to go and make sure everyone was doing all right. And now here he is pleading for his... You can imagine this guy. He is just running an errand for Dad. You put yourself in his shoes. He just was going to go and make sure everyone was doing all right. And now here he is pleading for his life. And all of a sudden now he's a part of a caravan, sold as a slave, and he's on his way to Egypt. And this caravan that comes along doesn't just happen to come along. God sends the caravan. And yet, in Joseph's mind, it has to be, I'm in this pit. This is a ridiculous thing for me to be in. It can't get any worse than this. Surely they're going to let me out. It's a big practical joke. And the next thing is he finds himself on the way to Egypt. And it looks like everything is completely out of control. Looks like his dream is foolishness headed towards Egypt. And yet God is in it. God is totally 100% in it. He sent the caravan to get this man to Egypt because he wants him in Egypt, because Egypt is where he's going to teach him the lessons that he needs to be taught. There are no accidents in our lives. I like to think there are. And I like to think that some of the things that come into my life that look especially tragic or especially difficult, or that there's no way God is going to work this together for good, that this puts, that it can be put into some kind of a category that, this will be the one that he won't be able to work together for good. And yet, the testimony of our life is always, by the time we get out of the trial, to realize that he just smothered it in his grace, and he was absolutely faithful, and he did work good out of it. And so this situation just gets worse and worse and worse, but it's by design, because God is digging deeper and deeper and deeper in this man's life. And he is trying to develop character here in Joseph's life, and he is developing it through a pretty tough family. Pretty tough upbringing, I'd say. Sounds like a pretty dysfunctional family to me. This whole thing seems pretty hard on his inner child, if you ask me. And I'm not just taking a cheap shot. You've got to examine these things. These are the things we're being inundated with. He's been raised with 10 cold-blooded murderers and thieves. That's his family. That's his family. His dad has a tendency to drift back into being a con man, a heel catcher, and quite an embarrassment every time he does. And his mom's dead, but his dad still has another wife and some concubines. And here he is in the midst of this kind of a family, in the violence of the family, the hatred of the entire family except for his dad towards him. And now when you think it can't get any worse, he loses the one family he has. He's gone at 17, taken away, stolen away. And so he's raised in the midst of tremendous strife and tremendous difficulties. And I categorically reject the idea that God is not big enough to overwhelm our childhoods and to work it together for good. There were times when I was growing up that I stayed awake all night because I was afraid that somebody in the household would murder us before the night was over. And I could go on for hours and tell you stories. And it doesn't work against you. Because what it develops in our lives is a character and at least a compassion that would not be there any other way. But if somebody wants to come to me and wants to begin to make me to feel sorry for myself, or to spend all of my life back there in that whole scene and trying to figure the whole thing out, I can't figure the whole thing out. And I don't know why all of it happened. All I know is that it brings forth fruit today. And you and I would not be who we are, and even as limitedly fruitful as we are, without the difficult things that were a part of our lives. And so we can go into all of the madness of trying to search all of it out and all, but the bottom line is he who he is? And can he and will he work it together for good? However horrific it might be, yes, he can. Yes, he can. And you have character in your life that would not be there otherwise. It just wouldn't be there. It's not working against you. It's all part of the preparation. And we watch in our lives. If we've walked with the Lord for longer than 2 weeks, and especially the longer we walk with the Lord, we see His hand in our life before we ever surrender to Him. We see His grace and how He was working all along. His fingerprints are everywhere. And so is the case in Joseph's life. So was the case. Character being developed in this way. And so he's taken now into Egypt. And Reuben returned to the pit. Apparently he had left for some time while all of this was going on. And Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. He didn't know what had happened to him. And he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go? I'm the oldest brother. I'm responsible for him. Where's he gone? What are we going to do?" And so now they've got to come up with some kind of a plan here to report to Jacob what's happened to his son. And so they took Joseph's tunic and they killed a kid of the goats and dipped the tunic in the blood. And they sent the tunic of many colors and they brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it's your son's tunic or not?" This is cruel beyond description. You don't do anything harder to a parent than this. There is nothing you can do harder to a parent than this. And he recognized it and he said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without a doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." And Jacob tore his clothes and he put sackcloth on his waist and he mourned for his son many days. And all the sons, what hard-heartedness. This is a cruel group. And all his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him. And he refused to be comforted, and he said to them, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." And thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And so now begins a period of 22 years that is going to go by before Joseph ever sees his father again. 22 years this is going to go on, this trial. It is interesting here as you look at this, the Midianites have no use for him. They sell him immediately in Egypt to Potiphar. And the word officer of Pharaoh, their officer, it has the meaning of eunuch. Now, he might have been a eunuch or he might not have been a eunuch, but it can be either way. But he might have been a eunuch, and we don't know. The captain of the guard literally means the captain of the slaughterers. This guy was the head of the executioners there in Pharaoh's court. He's the guy that killed the people, or headed up the guys that killed the people who